Safe Stitch. My name is Gisela, and this week we're going to dive deeper into needle felting. So in needle felting, you can actually get different types of needle felt needles, and they are usually referred to in gauges, and that refers to the thickness and size of the needle and the barbs at the end. So the lower gauge needles, which are usually things like a 36 gauge or a 38 gauge, are usually stronger, and it makes them much more suitable for starting off your piece. So if you are really beginning your needle felting, trying to make the base structure there, that's definitely the best needle there because it's far more durable to start doing your rough shaping. And then it goes up to things like a 40 or 42 gauge. So these high gauge needles are far more fine, and they're a lot more for delicate details in your needle felting. So if you're doing, let's say, a little animal and you're wanting to do little eyes on them, or the detail in their fur markings or something like that, you'll want to use a higher gauge needle, so something like a 40 or 42 gauge, because they are much more fine and more delicate. You wouldn't normally want to use these higher gauge needles for starting your project, because when you are shaping, it's a lot more kind of rough work there. You're working really to mesh those fibres together on a larger scale, and they're not really suitable for that. So when you start your project with your needle felt shaping, I would recommend starting somewhere with a 36 or a 38 gauge, and then working your way up to a 40 or 42 gauge when you are doing much more of the delicate work. Now you can also get different needle types, such as spiral, star and reverse. So I have a 38 gauge spiral, and the spiral needles, their barbs twist around at the end to felt quicker. And this gives a neater finish, so it minimises the surface holes that you can get with other needles. The spiral is not so good for the bulk sculpting work. So I also use a 38 gauge star, and this is good for firmer felting, coarser wools and joining pieces together. It can be good for slightly finer details, but it's a bit more of an all-rounder. And lastly, I also have a 38 gauge reverse. Now this needle, the barbs go actually in the other direction. They pull the fibres out rather than in. So this is really good for that fluffy finish on a well felted piece. So if you want that kind of fluffy sheep wool effect, if you're making an animal and you want them to have fluffy fur, the reverse needle is great for that. With the needles and the stabbing motion, it is really important to make sure that you are always stabbing in a kind of straight motion. You don't want to bend the needle at any point, because if you bend the needle, you're very likely to snap the end of it. So usually when I'm working, I want to try and keep it nice and straight. I tend to either go kind of vertically into the piece or horizontally. I never pop the needle in and start bending it around, because it will snap the delicate end there. So that's a really key thing to think about when you first get started with needle felting. In terms of the wool, there's a lot of variety to choose from, so I'm going to go through a selection of them with their pros and cons. So one of the best ones to use as a beginner is the core wool. And the reason for that is because it's inexpensive, and it's usually used for the core of your project. So rather than using another more expensive wool or a coloured wool, you would use a core wool to build up the shape, and then you can use other wools on top for that final detailing. Core wool is coarser and it's fast felting, and you would usually find this with mixed sheep breeds, Romney, Corriedale and Lincoln. Another really good option as a beginner is the Corriedale wool, and that is usually medium to fine, slightly coarse, but it's great for beginners because of that kind of slightly coarseness, that medium range there. So it's great for felting, and it's often dyed in a whole wide range of colours. Then there is Romney. So this is long wool, medium texture. It's a bit more coarse and springy. So it's good for core or textured surfaces, but not so great for that lovely smooth finish. Then there is Shetland. So this is slightly coarse and it felts really well. It's great for that realistic animal coat effect and projects that need that more wiry look. So for example, like a fur on an animal. So Shetland wool is great for that. Then we have alpaca or llama. It's not actually technically a wool, it's a fibre. So this is usually very fine and silky. It's quite slow to felt though, so it's not so great for sculpturing or that kind of starter wool. This is far more for that surface detailing. You may also hear the terms batting and roving in needle felting. So when they say batting, that means it's a sheet of carded wool with fibres going in multiple directions. So batting is really good because it felts faster, it's easier to shape because those fibres can kind of mesh together, and it's really great for sculptural and 3D work. And roving, also known as top, is combined wool fibres and they are aligned in one direction. So this is good for smooth layers and surface colours. It felts more slowly than batting. So batting is great for sculpting and roving is good for that decorative top layer. You do tend to see roving more readily available in shops there, and it does come in different colours, but usually you want to use that for the top layer, the top coat there, and the batting underneath as that kind of sculpting. You can also get things like coarse wool locks, which is usually found in Lincoln and Wensleydale wool. So this is really great if you want to get that curly mane or textured coat. So if you're making more realistic looking animals in your felting, that can be really great to make that effect. So just a little recap here. So the wools that I normally would recommend for beginners is the core wool for that base, that sculpting, and the Corriedale as well can be great at that. And I would use the roving wool to get the lovely smoother coloured wool over the top to get that kind of finishing coat layer. So in last week's episode, we talked about the basic kit that you would need to get started in needle felting, but I'm now going to talk about any extra tools that you could also use. So the first tool that you can use is called a multi-tool. So it is basically for multiple needle felt needles. Not only does it hold the multiple needles, but it usually has a handle as well, which is far easier to grip and work longer with than just a single needles. So you can get these both in plastic and wood, and it basically makes your felting go a lot quicker than just the single needle. Another useful tool is also a comb. It's a special needle felt comb, which is basically used to clean off your brush mat or your base. So the one that I have has two different combs on the end of it. One looks a little bit like a rake and the other one is like little fine bristles. So what can happen with your base is obviously as you felt, the fibres can get caught on the base, particularly if you're using brush mats because the bristles on them catch those fibres. So after a while you will find that it starts to really collect lots of the wool. So you don't want this obviously getting into your other projects, especially if you're going from a very strong bold colour and then you're working on a lovely white. You don't want those colours mixing into your next project. So the comb is really good for that. You basically just comb it over your surface, so over your brush mat, and then that just collects any of those spare fibres and you can clean that off. So that's just a really good cleanup tool to use. In terms of safety, I think I briefly mentioned this last week, but things like thimbles or some sort of finger guard can be very useful as well. When you're felting, it's super easy to catch your fingers and it does hurt with that needle and the barbs. So having a thimble or finger guard can just protect your fingers there because it's so easily done. Especially if you are working with a multi-tool, that is going to be a little bit more dangerous because obviously you've got more needles there. So having a little bit of protection for your fingers and thumbs can be really helpful too. So we're coming to the end of this week's episode. In next week's episode, we're going to be looking at children's summer fibercraft ideas to keep them busy over the holidays. If you can, please subscribe to my podcast. I would be so grateful. Additionally, I have a Patreon with different tiered memberships, so please do consider joining the Knot Weave Stitch community as it really helps keep the podcast alive. I also have an accompanying podcast blog on my website, which is www.giselanartin.com, which follows each episode, so feel free to take a little look at that. As ever, thank you so much for listening, and I will see you again in the next one.